The air hung heavy with salt and decay. Kahlan and Darius, adventurers drawn by whispers of forgotten treasures, stood upon the deck of an ancient, derelict ship. Moonlight glinted off tarnished metal, revealing the vessel's skeletal frame against the night sky. As they rounded a corner, a shape emerged from the gloom. Tall and gaunt, swathed in ragged bandages, the figure stood motionless. Kahlan drew her scimitar, the blade singing softly as it left its scabbard. The figure lunged. Steel met steel with a shower of sparks, the clash echoing through the ship's haunted depths. Panic welled up inside Darius. His fingers closed around a small box within his satchel, a device containing one of his most potent illusions. As Kahlan parried another blow, Darius activated the device. A blinding light erupted from the box, momentarily banishing the shadows. An ethereal warrior in the projection readied itself for battle, its image shimmering in the stale air. But the approaching figures, their bandages stained and tattered, seemed unmoved. One of the figures, its movements jerky and unnatural, reached out and swatted at the illusion. Its hand passed through the shimmering image, disrupting the light and causing it to vanish with a faint, mournful sigh. Darius struggled against the figure's grip, its touch sending a wave of nausea through him. A sharp blow landed on the back of his head. Pain exploded in his skull, blinding him momentarily. He slumped against the figure holding him, his vision darkening at the edges. Darius awoke to a throbbing pain in his head and a stench that turned his stomach. He lay on a cold, damp floor, his limbs bound tightly with rough rope. He blinked, trying to clear the fog of unconsciousness, his surroundings slowly coming into focus. He was in a cage, its metal bars tarnished with age and rust. Kahlan struggled to sit up, her head swimming with dizziness. She looked around the chamber, taking in their surroundings. The air hung heavy with the smell of rancid fat and something else, something metallic and vaguely sweet. Near the center of the room, a large makeshift pot bubbled over an even larger open fire, its contents emitting a dark, noxious smoke that stung her nostrils. "What happened?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "They fear you," Darius rasped, his voice hoarse. He watched the shadowy figures moving around the chamber, their movements stiff and mechanical. They moved with a strange, unsettling precision, like puppets controlled by unseen strings. Kahlan raised an eyebrow, her expression skeptical. "Fear? Those things? They nearly bashed our skulls in and tossed us in this cage." "They move like old men," Kahlan murmured, her gaze fixed on the figures. She leaned closer to the bars, her sharp eyes missing nothing. Their bandages, the way they creak and groan. There's something not right about them. She took a deep breath, the stench of the chamber making her stomach churn. It's as if they're... "We have to get out of here," Darius said, his voice urgent. He scanned their cage, searching for a way out, a weakness in the ancient metal. He knew that time was running out, that their captors, whatever their purpose, wouldn't leave them to rot in this cage forever. If that cauldron is any indication. "We'll be stew before sunrise," Kahlan finished, her voice grim. Kahlan's eyes widened as she saw the blue flame. "What is that?" she whispered, a flicker of hope igniting in her chest. "What have you got there, Sage?" "Something that might just save our skins," Darius said, his voice tight with tension. He kept the flame trained on the approaching figures, their movements faltering as they backed away from the unnatural light. Kahlan moved like a whirlwind, her scimitar reaping a bloody toll. The ghouls, caught off guard by their sudden attack, clumsily tried to defend themselves. Their movements, so precise a moment ago, were now sluggish, their decaying limbs no match for Kahlan's fury. Sparks showered the chamber as her blade met metal, the air thick with the stench of burning oil and singed flesh. As Kahlan pressed her attack, Darius took a moment to study their attackers. Up close, the ghouls were even more grotesque than he'd imagined. Their decaying flesh, a patchwork of rotting bandages and tarnished metal, clung to their skeletal frames like cobwebs. Their eyes, glowing with a faint internal light, were devoid of life, reflecting only a cold mechanical purpose. Kahlan ducked under a flailing arm, her scimitar flashing through the air. The ghoul staggered back, its torso sheared almost completely through, sparks and gore showering from its exposed insides. It let out a final screech before collapsing in a heap of smouldering cloth. 3 of the ghouls were down, and there were 3 to go. Kahlan felt a surge of adrenaline, but she knew she couldn't keep this up forever. Kahlan! Darius shouted, pointing towards the cauldron. The cauldron! Can you tip it over? Kahlan glanced at the cauldron, then back at Darius, a flicker of understanding in her eyes. She had noticed it too, a subtle hesitation in the ghouls' movements whenever they got too close to the boiling liquid. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Whatever those cauldrons contained instilled a primal fear in them, a fear that even their ancient undead minds could not completely suppress. She lunged towards the cauldron, her scimitar held high. The ghouls, sensing her intentions, hesitated for a moment, their undead minds struggling to reconcile with this new, unexpected threat. That moment of hesitation was all Kahlan needed. With a surge of adrenaline, she slammed her shoulder into the cauldron, the metal screeching in protest as it tipped precariously. The pungent, oily liquid sloshed over the edge, splattering onto the floor with a sickening hiss. The ghouls recoiled as one, their movements suddenly frantic, their wails rising in pitch. The scent of the spilled liquid, acrid and oily, seemed to short-circuit something deep within them, triggering a primal fear that even they could not ignore. Panic seized the remaining ghouls. Their movements, once cold and precise, became erratic, their rotting limbs flailing wildly as they retreated from the spreading pool of liquid. One stumbled, its leg buckling beneath its weight, and crashed to the floor in a shower of sparks. The stench of burning oil and fear filled the air, choking in its intensity. Kahlan didn't hesitate. She pressed her advantage, her scimitar a blur of silver as she cut down the remaining ghouls. Darius, clutching the sputtering relic, followed close behind, his heart pounding against his ribs. The chamber, now engulfed in flames, was a scene of utter chaos. The spilled liquid from the cauldron burned with a fierce intensity, casting grotesque shadows that danced across the walls. The air was thick with smoke and the acrid stench of burning metal and flesh. "This way!" Kahlan shouted, her voice barely audible above the roar of the flames. She pointed towards a narrow passageway, its entrance partially obscured by smoke and debris. It was a desperate gamble, but it was their only chance. Darius followed Kahlan into the passageway, the heat from the inferno behind them scorching their backs. The air was thick with smoke, making it difficult to breathe. He coughed, his lungs burning, his eyes stinging. The passageway was narrow, barely wide enough for them to walk side by side. The walls were cold and damp, the stones slick with condensation. The floor sloped downwards, leading deeper into the bowels of the ancient ship. They ran, their footsteps echoing in the confined space. Behind them, the roar of the flames grew louder, the heat more intense. Darius risked a glance back over his shoulder and saw a wall of fire advancing towards them, its flames licking at the ceiling, consuming everything in its path. "We have to hurry," he gasped, his voice hoarse. "It's right behind us." The passageway opened into a small circular chamber. A single flickering lantern, suspended from a rusty chain, cast long, distorted shadows across the walls. The air was still and heavy, the silence broken only by the sound of their ragged breathing. Kahlan leaned against the wall, her chest heaving, her scimitar dripping blood onto the floor. Darius slumped down beside her, his legs trembling with exhaustion. He dropped the relic, its blue flame sputtering and dying, plunging the chamber into near darkness. "We made it," he whispered, his voice barely a croak. "For now," Kahlan said, her voice grim. "But we're not out of this yet. We're trapped down here with no way of knowing what's waiting for us." She pushed herself away from the wall and scanned their surroundings. The chamber was bare except for a pile of rotting timbers in one corner and a narrow doorway on the opposite side. "Where does that lead?" Darius asked, his voice tight with apprehension. "Only one way to find out," Kahlan said. She retrieved her scimitar and approached the doorway cautiously, her senses on high alert. They passed through the doorway and found themselves in a narrow corridor that sloped gently upwards. The corridor was lined with a series of small barred windows offering glimpses of the night sky beyond. Kahlan paused at one of the windows and peered out. Darius joined her, his heart sinking as he saw what she saw. The ancient ship, its once mighty hull now blackened and scorched by fire, was moving slowly across a vast, desolate plain. The ground beneath them was flat and barren, stretching out as far as the eye could see. The moon, a pale disk in the night sky, cast long, eerie shadows across the desolate landscape. "By the gods!" Darius breathed, his voice filled with disbelief. "How is this possible?" Kahlan didn't answer. She was staring out the window, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and horror. She had seen many strange and terrible things in her lifetime, but nothing could have prepared her for this. The ancient ship, she realized with a growing sense of dread, was not a ship at all. It was something else entirely, something alive. The ancient vessel shuddered beneath their feet, a groan of metal echoing through its depths. Kahlan gripped the edge of the window, her knuckles white as bone. From their vantage point, they could see the ship's transformation. The once inert hull now pulsed with a sickly blue light. Metal plates shifted and groaned, revealing monstrous appendages. "It's impossible," Darius whispered, his voice trembling. He gripped Kahlan's arm, seeking solace in her strength. But even her usual stoicism seemed strained. The impossible was unfolding before their eyes, a nightmare given form. The appendages, colossal in size, pulsed with an eerie internal light. They resembled the limbs of some monstrous insect, their surfaces covered in chitinous plates that shimmered under the pale moonlight. With each movement, the ship groaned and creaked, its metal bones protesting this unnatural awakening. The ground trembled as the ship, propelled by its newfound limbs, lurched forward. The movement sent Darius and Kahlan stumbling back from the window, their faces pale with terror. The ship was no longer a lifeless hulk, a relic of a bygone age. It was a living creature, a thing of nightmares, and they were trapped inside its belly. Kahlan drew her scimitar, the blade a beacon of defiance in the face of the unimaginable. But even her warrior's spirit wavered as she looked upon the creature that was once their prison. The whispers started then, faint at first, like the rustling of dry leaves, but growing steadily louder. Darius clutched his head, his eyes wide with terror. The whispers, he realized with a growing sense of horror, were inside his mind. They slithered through his thoughts, cold and insidious, whispering of ancient evils and forgotten gods. "What is happening?" Kahlan demanded, her voice tight with tension. She glanced around the corridor, searching for the source of the whispers, but they seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Darius shook his head, his face contorted in a silent scream. He couldn't answer her, couldn't articulate the horrors that were invading his mind. The whispers were growing louder, more insistent, threatening to overwhelm his sanity. The ancient ship, now a monstrous, chitinous behemoth, continued its relentless march across the desolate plain. The ground trembled and cracked beneath its weight, the air thick with decay. Kahlan grabbed Darius's arm, her grip like iron. "We have to get out of here," she whispered. "Now!" She pulled him towards the narrow staircase. It was their only chance. As they climbed, the ship shuddered violently. The whispers in Darius's mind reached a deafening crescendo. He stumbled, his vision blurring. Kahlan caught him before he could fall. "Darius, focus!" she shouted. "We have to keep moving." They emerged onto the main deck. The deck was a scene of utter devastation. Metal plates were twisted and torn. A gaping maw, lined with razor-sharp teeth, opened beneath them. The ancient ship had become a predator, and they were about to be devoured. The stench of decay, overpowering and cloying, washed over them as the maw yawned beneath their feet. It pulsed with an eerie blue light, rows of razor-sharp teeth glinting like obsidian shards in the darkness. Kahlan, her hand instinctively tightening around the hilt of her scimitar, felt a primal fear grip her heart, a terror that transcended the realm of the physical. This was something ancient, something evil, a creature born of nightmares and fueled by forgotten gods. Darius, his mind reeling from the whispers that clawed at his sanity, could only stare in mute horror. The world around him, once familiar and reassuring, had dissolved into a tapestry of madness, a waking nightmare from which there seemed to be no escape. The ship groaned beneath them, a symphony of tortured metal and ancient magic, as if the very fabric of reality was unraveling around them. Kahlan, her instincts honed from countless battles, knew that standing there meant certain death. The maw was closing in, its teeth a hungry chasm promising oblivion. She had faced down monstrous creatures before, had stared death in the face and emerged victorious. But this was different. This was a terror that struck at the very core of her being, a darkness that threatened to consume her soul. "Darius!" she shouted, her voice barely a whisper above the cacophony of sounds that assaulted their senses. "We have to jump!" Darius, his eyes glazed over with a terrifying emptiness, didn't respond. The whispers had taken root deep within his mind, their icy tendrils ensnaring his thoughts, his will. Kahlan, her heart pounding against her ribs, realized with a sinking feeling that he was lost to her, lost to the insidious power that held this monstrous ship in its thrall. The deck beneath their feet lurched violently, the monstrous creature shifting its weight as it prepared to devour its prey. Chunks of metal and wood splintered and fell away, vanishing into the depths of the maw. The air grew heavy, thick with the stench of decay and a strange metallic tang that made Kahlan's stomach churn. There was no time for hesitation, no time for second thoughts. Kahlan, her instincts screaming at her to flee, to escape this nightmare at any cost, made a split-second decision. She grabbed Darius's arm, his flesh cold and clammy beneath her touch, and with a desperate prayer to whatever gods might be listening, she threw herself and Darius towards the edge of the collapsing deck. They plunged into the darkness, the chilling sound of the creature's roar echoing behind them. The air rushed past them, whipping at their clothes, tearing at their skin. Kahlan closed her eyes, her grip on Darius tightening instinctively, and for a moment there was nothing but the sensation of falling, of surrendering to the abyss. Then with a bone-jarring impact they hit the ground. Kahlan gasped for breath, her lungs burning. She lay there, dazed and disoriented. They were alive. She pushed herself up, scanning their surroundings. The monstrous ship moved away on the salt flats. The moon cast eerie shadows across the desolate landscape. Darius lay beside her, breathing shallowly. His eyes were closed, his face pale. Kahlan shook his shoulder, relief and terror mixing. Darius, wake up!" He groaned and his eyelids fluttered open. His gaze met hers, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. "Kahlan," he whispered. What happened?" Kahlan looked at the ship receding into the distance. They had escaped, but the nightmare was far from over. They were adrift in a world where the impossible was real. They were alive for now, but the question remained, for how long?